Stu, I was looking at your piece, your commentary. I'm just going to turn to the side here and read this. And you end by saying the effective use of literature depends on the stage of illness and emotional, spiritual maturity of the patient. And I really agree that we need to be aware of the spiritual maturity of a patient. And I was wondering, how do you balance between being with a patient where they are right now in their spiritual maturity, and I sometimes see illness as a time where there's an opportunity for somebody to grow spiritually. So how do you balance between encouraging someone to grow and being with them where they are in their current state of maturity?
So this is a tough question because it's not a direct or simple answer to it. I think this is a series of complexities. First of all, we have to find what spirituality means in the first place to figure out what spiritual maturity is. So for me, in my definition, it's a sense of awe, thankfulness, and hope. And then I would add to that the ability to have intention and to act on those first three issues. So that's pretty complex in assessing a person at a stage of illness. But certainly when one walks into a room, you're aware, I think, of what the stage of illness is.
Yes, yeah.
And if the person is in recovery, or on the way to recovery, or has hope for recovery, and asked to pray, that might mean something very different, I think, than if they're terminal and they're asking to pray. In either event, it seems to me that the person who's in recovery can be asking for a relief of suffering, or they could be thankful. And then what is the nature of the request then? It seems to me in both cases the person is asking you to be with them and to be connected in some way. So assessing the spiritual maturity at that point is really conditional on what we interpret the request to us to be about. Is it the relief of suffering, or is it thankfulness, or is it to create and generate hope? All of those are opportunities for the person at that moment. And any answer in which, even if we're just with them and holding their hand, is a growth. It's not even an opportunity for growth. It is a growth.
So you're saying anytime there's a connection made, there's growth.
I think so. And I think the large part of being ill or in the stage of illness facing death, the issue is based on the serious matter of connectedness. The person does not want to be alone. And that to me encompasses the opportunity to have awe and thankfulness and hope and intentionality, and to act on that in some way, even if it's being silent. I see that connection that the person is making with the other as growth in and of itself.
Right.
If it's a terminal patient, I think that this is a very different story. Is the patient in so much fear that it's over? And then the request is also a request for comfort. Mm-hmm. Or is it that the person has reached a stage of acceptance, which I would also define as a mature, emotional, spiritual approach to death, is to say, okay, this is it. And then, is it the request to look over one's life? Or is it the request just to be with them in the process of transiting out.
Before we continue, I want to turn on the overhead light. Hang on a second. Stu, listening to you, I'm realizing that we almost have to back up and define what we mean by spiritual maturity. And
Right.
so it sounds like what you're saying is an ability to, let me see if I can summarize this correctly. Spiritual maturity is an ability to connect, an ability to experience awe, and maybe an ability to articulate a range of emotions and reactions to whatever the stage of illness is. Does that seem like what you're trying to say?
Yeah, for me, again, I break it down into essentially three categories that I would assess as looking at whether the person is spiritually mature or not. One is, can they have awe? So if a person is sick and they say, I'd like to pray because I can't believe what's happening to me and that it's being treated. Wow. That's one issue. The other is, okay, I'm getting better, and I'm really thankful for that. And I want to express thankfulness through a prayer. And the third is hope, in that if we lose that, we're dead. And at the end of life, maybe hope is the ability to accept this transition. So in my assessment of people's spirituality, I think those three components are extraordinarily critical. That's why I like the Asher Yatzar prayer so much, because it encompasses all three of those facets. The respect for God who fashions man with wisdom. I mean, what a wonderful expression of awe. And that it would be impossible for us to survive before you if any of our vessels were blocked, right, is thankfulness. And Hashem, who heals all flesh, is the expression of hope. I love this prayer because it's got all of it at one time. We're saying, wow, I'm a conscious entity. I'm so thankful that I have had my consciousness, and I'm about to give it up. Nothing's more frightening to a self-conscious entity than to lose self-consciousness. And I think that in that case, this is where the hope comes in, but being able to, even in that time, to being able to say, it's been great, is a level of spiritual maturity. And to ask someone to pray with you during that time, the selection of which prayer I think is so critically important, because as we discussed before, my cup runneth over might not mean so, or something different to somebody who's just about to transit out of life than somebody who's actually in a stage of recovery from illness.
Yeah.
So it's very...
Go ahead.
Yeah, it's very differentially applied, I think. Differentially analyzed and differentially applied.
Yeah. Some of this can be so counterintuitive because in my experience at the hospital, some of the patients who express the most gratitude are patients who are dying. Because they've really stopped. I mean, not every patient. I mean, for sure, you have many patients who go into death with a lot of fear and with loss of hope. But sometimes, because those patients are so intensely in a place of life review, that they can be feeling very grateful for things small and large that have occurred in their life.
Right. Well, that's the ego integrity versus despair story. Erik Erikson's 8 stages. It's the last stage. Is I can have ego integrity. I can review my life. I can see that it was worthwhile. My cup runneth over, or I can approach this in despair. And which is the more spiritually mature? I mean, that's a really tough question, because it's so dependent on what's happening to this person at that very moment. And for me, my experience with this is that people just want you to be with them, whether they're in a stage of recovering from illness or they're a stage in transiting out of life. The most important thing, I think, is this issue of connectedness. And the prayer in and of itself is a connecting vehicle. I mean, it's got a rhythm to it, that's healing in and of itself.
Yeah.
And
I can't remember who talks about this, but a communication expert talked about the fact that only 5% of what we communicate are the words ourselves. So going back to Psalm 23, 5% of what you're communicating when you recite that is the word itself. But so much of it is about tone and body language and inflection and all of that.
so it depends which part of the brain you want to appeal to. If you want to approach this from a cognitive level, we might have less success than if we approach it from an issue of the basic brain, which responds to rhythm and responds to personal connection and touching, and if we want to take it at an intellectual level, it's a whole different story. I think the issue of spirituality for me is this dialogue that goes on in between the limbic system and the cerebral cortex. And it's a dialogue. I mean, this is our tradition as a man is both a animal and an angel at the same time. So, we've got a basic reptilian brain covered up by a cerebral cortex, and there's this wonderful dialogue that goes on between these two parts of the brain in almost any decision making. And I think we have to kind of appeal to both in the patient who's suffering or who's ill, because both of those parts of the brain are working. They're both trying to figure out what's going on. And I think I come back to this issue of self-awareness because it's so important to me in thinking about spirituality. We're one of the few animals on Earth that's self-aware. There are only a couple of others. But, the most frightening thing to a self-aware creature is to lose self-awareness.
Right, you were saying that before. And so perhaps that's partly where a fear of death comes from.
I think it does.
Yeah.
I think it does. And I think the issue of spirituality, on a very primitive level, is to deal with the fear of death. At a cognitive level, it's to elevate the ordinary. And that's already a whole different story. The person who's spiritually mature, I think, is a person who has a balance between those two pieces of themselves, and that they're about to give it up, and the level of acceptance is so important. In fighting disease, however, it's the contraction of the patient with the healer, and being a participant in that healing, which is the hope part. And the action part and the intention part. I'm intent on being hopeful. I'm intent on raising this illness to something more than just an illness. The Dalai Lama has a great mantra on this that I read one time. He says about suffering, he says, "May this suffering make me more compassionate to the suffering of others." I think that's great,
Yeah.
And even inside a hospital, I have seen patients helping each other in a way that, they're suffering, but they're compassionate to the suffering of others. That's a spiritually mature person.
Yeah, I always, if a patient asks me to pray with them, I always ask, what do you want to pray for today?
Right.
And there definitely are times when patients say, I want to pray for everybody on this unit to be healed, or for the healing of everybody in the hospital. So.
Wonderful.
Well, thank you, Stu. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I look forward to meeting you in person someday.
I hope so.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.